Joining us now is Chris Perry, the publisher of Equity Guru, the controversial Chris Perry. You had an incident at your event today.
Yes, I know I'm doing the right thing when I've got not just hecklers, but people being physically thrown out of the talk.
Wow.
That's actually the second time it's happened to me, one of those things.
You pissed off the wrong person.
You know, sometimes people are tired and emotional. There's no accounting for their individual problems.
Yeah. So people who follow you know that you're very deeply involved with cannabis in terms of coverage. And so here you are at VRIC, a mining conference. So what's your feeling in being on the floor and talking to people? Is a lot of money coming out of cannabis because people think, okay, that's done with, and moving into mining?
Not yet.
No?
The cannabis investor generally, 97% of it is retail, it's not institutional. So that money is not necessarily looking for the next thing. It's in cannabis because they know cannabis. They don't necessarily know resources. The cannabis investor doesn't understand a 43101 or a PEA. And if you show them the numbers that are on the backdrops of most of the booths here, they move their eyes across. So for me, the way in for that investor might be energy metals. It might be something where, in my pocket I've got 12 different metals, keeping my phone alive and my RFID tags. I think you can tell that story and people can understand it, but when it comes to the actual process of a resource company moving from explorer to production, that's still a bridge too far. And so what I think probably if there are any crossover investors, they're just looking at charts and seeing what's running hot. And that right now would be gold.
Right. We've talked to a few energy metals companies like Global Energy Metals and others. So are there any names in that sector that intrigue you or not necessarily?
Well, yeah, but nothing that would surprise anybody. I like Great Bear, I like BlackRock. There are companies that are actually doing the work is a good thing. I like Barian. We've been supporting Barian for the last 6 months or so.
Right, we talked to them.
It's just taking off a little bit now. Anyone who's doing the work. The tradition in resources has long been to stretch things out for as long as possible because you don't want to spoil a good story by actually drilling it. I want to see guys actually doing flow-through financing and dedicated to putting drills into the ground.
So do you think, so when it comes to, again, comparing and contrasting cannabis with mining, is investing just investing, or is it something very specific in mining and investors really need to look for certain things? And you talked about the complexity for some people, it's too much for them.
So I think one of the changes in investing in the small cap space over the last few years, specifically around cannabis, has been herd mentality. There's always people who are going to look at a strong chart and jump in, but in cannabis that takes it to the next extreme. There are companies that we've done reports on where we've said, look, this company from day one is destined for bankruptcy. There's nothing good about this company, and you'll still find people who are like, well, but it's cheap, it's going up. That sort of thinking obviously applies across the board, but there's very stark differences between cannabis and resources where I think there needs to be a few other sectors maybe in the middle that get people into a place where they start reading balance sheets and start looking at who are the people actually running the company and what are the macroeconomic effects, et cetera, et cetera.
So off air you were talking about the whole Gretzky model, or that famous Gretzky quote that many people talk about, you go where the puck is going.
Right.
So you mentioned energy metals. What's next? Like, what else do you see? Where is the puck going elsewhere?
So in resources, I like what copper looks like. There's definitely a supply and demand glitch. There's a few other metals like that, but I kind of get back to cannabis a little bit in what I see in mushrooms, in psychedelics right now. Although not really legal, I kind of look back at what's happening in that sector right now as what happened in cannabis in 2013. You had court cases moving forward that maybe might bring it legal. You have a medical use that is definitely interesting and that a lot of people would like to be able to access right now. You got a lot of venture capital money coming into it. So I kind of look at what's happening in that space. There's no one you could really point to and say, buy that right now.
Right.
But I think the realities of having a gigantic cannabis grow with a greenhouse roof in the snow by the airport in Edmonton and not being able to really make that financially viable, that you take the roof and cover it up, turn the lights off, that's a mushroom grow without any extra expense.
Right.
So I think there's going to be a lot of pressure on government to make that switch, and there's going to be a lot of cannabis companies desperately flailing around trying to find what's next that will gladly jump into that. And there's actually been a couple of companies, Yield Growth Corp is one that has kind of hinted that it's going into that space. Naturally Splendid is a company that creates protein bars that already has mushroom-based bars, non-psychedelic, but you know, they're a simple tweak to make that a reality. So I feel like the same thing we saw in cannabis that blew everything up could potentially happen in that space as a means of saving a lot of the dollars that right now are heading to zero in the cannabis area.
Interesting. We'll follow that trend. Thanks, Chris.
No worries.
All right, good stuff. Chris Perry, publisher of Equity Guru.